The race for the One Piece is officially on. In this chapter, Eiichiro Oda lays out every major character and faction that are going to be integral to the final saga and the eventual crowning of the new Pirate King. This is a landmark chapter in One Piece history, and it's about race in more ways than one. Because while Vegapunk doesn't heavily enlighten us on stuff that we don't know in this chapter, he does touch on an interesting thing, being the extinction and persecution of certain races throughout history. And while he's talking about this on this single page, we see Bartholomew Kuma, Charlotte Pudding, and King, all three of whom are the only known living representations of their respective races. The Buccaneers, the Three-Eyed Tribe, and the Lunarians. The latter two of which we've never even seen any other members of, even in a flashback. And all of whom are currently facing extinction, because Kuma will be dead very shortly, if not already, while Charlotte Pudding is in prison, and King looks like he may also be in prison, or at least a very dark place. It's hard to tell, but prison is what I'd assumed. We haven't seen King since he was defeated by Green Bull on Wano, so my assumption was that he would have been taken to Impel Down, because where else could you possibly hold someone with a bounty of over 1 billion berries? But that was a bad, very bad assumption to make on my part. Firstly, because he's still all bandaged up, and if he went to Impel Down, they would have given him the funky prisoner uniform. So this might indicate that Green Bull actually failed in capturing King and Queen, mostly because he pissed his plants after feeling the sheer girthsome haki of Shanks. And looking back on it, Green Bull requested a marine ship to make its way into Wano, assumedly to take custody of King and Queen, which almost certainly never happened. So I guess King is just out there somewhere in the world. I'd say he flew away from Wano, but Zoro sliced one of his wings off. Either way, it's unclear whether or not King is actually hearing Vegapunk's message, but regardless, King has to be joining us for the final war, right? King's whole thing is that he was waiting for the Joy Boy, and initially he served Kaido ever so loyally because he thought that Kaido may have been Joy Boy. So King is a very natural ally, and unless there are any other non-Seraphim Lunarians out there, an integral figure in the climax of this story. And of course, I'd say the same thing about Charlotte Pudding, because the Three-Eyed Tribe are now softly implied by Oda as having been allies of the Ancient Kingdom, hence why they've become so rare, because they were probably the target of an extermination like the Buccaneers and the Lunarians, for their assorted crimes against the world government. And something I find really cool is how Oda has had this in mind for at least all of post-timeskip One Piece, and he made sure that both Wano and Whole Cake Island included a member of these near-extinct races that would go on to play major roles down the line. In fact, Pudding was introduced at the end of Fishman Island, so this is insanely good planning. And it's very satisfying to see both Whole Cake Island and Wano still continuing to pay us narrative dividends after such a large investment on our part. To the Buccaneers though, a small thing I really liked here are the dual panels of Bartholomew Kuma. We see him in the modern day lying on the giant warrior pirate ship, and then the flashback panel has him in more or less the same framing. And this is an invitation for the anime to do something amazing, because the only difference in the panels are the position of Kuma's head. So it's practically begging for a transition where modern day Kuma moves his head down, and by the time it reaches a stop, we're in the past. And as if this one singular page doesn't have enough, we also catch up with Marco on Sphinx Island, also known as the location where Whitebeard was born, and that's why Marco now serves as its caretaker in retirement. And he has a flashback that, rather embarrassingly for him, he's had before, almost exactly the same as well. During Wano, when Marco discovered that King was a Lunarian, he had the same flashback of Whitebeard talking about the land of gods that was supposedly on top of the Red Line. So look, Oda's pulling a bit of a Toei here by reusing flashbacks. I do feel like Oda could have put maybe a little bit more information in here, but it's always nice to see Marco. And I wonder if this is gonna bring him out of retirement for one last job again. And while we're on this section, I think it's also worth lingering on the Skypiea check-in, because up until this point, Oda has been avoiding Skypiea in our world tour, which makes sense because they don't have any way of actually listening to this message. At the moment, they're even more isolated than Wano. And in this panel, we see Wiper, and if you're not up to date on his cover story movements, he and the other major warrior leaders of Shandia now serve as God's guardians, God being gone for. We also see Konus, who is carrying what appears to be a basket of what I believe are pumpkin noodles, because during the time skip, she started a pumpkin cafe with Rocky, as they became best friends after Enel's death game. And finally, we see Isa, who looks like she's just finished a shift at Wagomuland, a theme park they built inspired by Usopp and the rubber band technology he introduced to the Sky People. And Isa works there as a balloon vendor, which is a much more exciting job than it sounds, because balloons are made out of the fabled rubber substance and are thus very, very exciting. Balloons on Skypiea are a pretty big deal. But all of that lovely, peaceful life aside, they've really had it good for the past 2 years. This panel is very important, because this is the chapter that shows us every faction that is going to be key to the final saga. And the Sky People are certainly no exception to that, especially Shandia, because their tribe was directly entrusted with protecting one of the poneglyphs, just like Alabasta and Fishman Island. Which, speaking of, we we also see panels of Vivi and Shirahoshi right above the panel of Skypiea. And again, this is almost absurdly purposeful, because this is the part where Vegapunk is talking about the scary ancient weapons. So we see Shirahoshi, who is Poseidon, then Vivi, whose country was torn apart by a dude just looking for Pluton, and Skypiea because Uranus was probably directly linked back to them during the ancient times. Back to Egghead though, this looks like the conclusion of the tragic tale of Jewelry Bonny and Bartholomew Kuma, with Bonny and Luffy teaming up to jump an old man, which usually I wouldn't encourage, but in this case, mate. And speaking of encouraging, Luffy encouraging Bonny in this chapter is what I would call an Oda father-daughterism, because Oda's writing style did change quite drastically after he had two daughters of his own, and that's why you get stuff like the end of Dressrosa, where Luffy appeared out of nowhere and got all up in Rebecca's personal business by asking her if she was okay with the situation with her father, and then carried her to Kuros and gave them that happy ending. Luffy's a good guy, he does good things, some of those good things are helping people, but he usually stays very disconnected from their personal lives. So what he did with Rebecca was sweet but quite uncharacteristic. And that's because Oda tends to use Luffy as divine intervention for whenever a character reminds him, Oda, of his own real life situation. He has a core desire to see happiness in the father-daughter dynamic. And here Oda's doing the same thing with Bonny. This time from Bonny's perspective, Luffy is literal divine intervention, and Oda is using him to give Bonny and Kuma the best ending available to them under the current circumstances. Although in this case it makes an extra degree of sense because Bonny's powers can only function if she believes they can. So it's not just your stereotypical believe in yourself young manga protagonist. Believe in yourself and produce your inner power thing. It's not that. And even if it was that, I really don't care, because after Bonny succeeds, we see this panel of Kuma performing what I believe is a very subtle smile, or at least a not frown. His expression definitely changed from the previous panel we saw him in, which was very sad. There was such a sad curve. And this is everything I wanted, as well as everything Kuma wanted, which was to watch his daughter become free. Now his job here is done, and he can finally move on and hopefully rest in peace. And of course, the conclusion against Saint Saturn was very satisfying to see as well. Luffy and Bonny doing their absolute best to liberate Saturn from life, which is very well deserved after Saturn had torturously removed pieces of Kuma. And so now it's pretty fun to see him getting torn to pieces as well. This is the first time I think Saint Saturn can call himself holy and have it actually be true because of all of the holes. And mate, just on the holes, those were some incredibly strong punches. Every single one of them blowing a new piece of Saturn away. It's like a reverse jigsaw puzzle. And I don't know, something about seeing that panel of Saturn with all of his legs and such crumbling, it was morbidly satisfying. It would admittedly be nicer if I didn't know that he could regenerate and that he'll probably be back. Although, there is a chance that Oda might just get rid of him right here and now. Mostly because I've been thinking, and this is not a good thing, but I've been thinking about how much more value Saint Saturn could possibly provide to this story. I'd go so far as to call him the main antagonist of Egghead Island, and I think he served that role to perfection. His story is directly linked to Bonny and Kuma, and our focus on that is ending here, so I really don't know how much more we gain by keeping Saint Saturn around. At the moment, I consider him sort of like Jack, a brilliant antagonist on Zou, whose natural disaster motif had a beginning, middle, and end, but he survived and was carried over to Wano, and didn't do a whole lot there but take up time and space that could have been given to one of the billions of other characters. So if Saturn survives, I think it would purely be so that he could be used as some other character's final fight, which doesn't excite me too much. Again, I saw what happened with Jack. It was nice that Inuarashi got a moment, but I don't know. What does excite me, however, is that I think I'm seeing Saint Saturn falling into water. So if he is a Devil Fruit user, we are well and truly in drowning territory here. That, or we still have Emmett's final thing it is that he plans on using, and if that is some sort of weapon, then Saturn might now be in a state so injured that even he can't regenerate in time to survive whatever Emmett is about to do. And to bring up the Egghead incident again, look, this has been touted as historic. And yes, we have Vegapunk's message, and that's pretty cool, but something that would really be a turning point for this world would be the death of an Elder Star. Now, I can't be bothered to go through and count, but I think this is a solid contender for One Piece chapter featuring the most named characters. There's probably some Marineford chapters that beat it, but this is still wild. They're not just any old named characters either. These are real important people, many of which we're not even going to go through because we'll be here all day. Like Kizaru, for example, he's here still lying down and having a well-earned rest after murdering a friend for the sake of something justice. I think the only reason we see him is because he's tied to Bonny's story, and again, this is where we're closing that. Same thing with Sentomaru. We get quick flashes of them to conclude the whole Bonny arc, and it is admittedly nice to see the shame smeared across Kizaru's face because he's listening to what Bonny's saying about all of the stuff with her mom and her dad, and Kizaru knows that he has been actively helpful in ruining this 12-year-old girl's life. I did the thing. I said I wasn't going to talk about Kizaru and then I just couldn't shut up. But I don't know, that's Oda. These small panels, they're not just haphazard reaction shots. There's a lot of meaning behind each and every one of them, and it's really difficult not to read into them. But I'm going to resist because I have to address the last few pages of this chapter, which gave me genuine chills. Because it was like watching athletes line up in their lanes and hearing the starting gun go off for the race. Except that there's a few more competitors than I initially thought. Before getting into that, I do want to address what a landmark moment this is though, because this might go over some people's heads, but One Piece began with Roger speaking to the world and igniting the Great Age of Piracy. Then the halfway point of the series, the pre-time skip era, ended with Whitebeard speaking to the world, reigniting that flame and kicking the race into its next phase. And now that we're in the final saga, Vegapunk is speaking to the world and making that race tangible once more. This is the last time this is going to happen, because we're not talking about some sort of theoretical legendary treasure anymore. One of the 12 people on this final page is going to find the One Piece. And I've never really considered this seriously, but here I believe Oda is presenting the idea that the Marines are going to make a serious effort to find the One Piece after hearing Vegapunk's message. That they are going to launch a full-scale attempt to join this already insanely huge conflict in order to prevent it from falling into the hands of one of the 4 emperors. And it's a pretty logical step. I'm honestly surprised that they haven't launched an effort before now, because that would be a great way to get rid of the Great Age of Piracy, to have the Marines conquer Laugh Tale and take custody of the One Piece. But from the perspective of the average Marine, it's about protecting peace. If Vegapunk is correct and the future of this planet depends entirely on who finds the One Piece and what they decide to do, then you'd probably want that future in your hands rather than one of them nasty pirates or the Revolutionary Army, who are also prominently featured in the amazing final 2-page spread of the 12 people most essential to the series going forward. Oda didn't draw these guys by accident. They are the representatives of every major faction that is going to be involved in this one last struggle for the world. And I have to say, what a cast. If you'd asked me to construct a list of the most important figures going forward, then there's a few people I'm not sure I would have included here. Kobe, for example, feels very out of place initially because he is surrounded on all sides by the true legends of the One Piece world. Here, he's being flanked by Emo on one side and Figgle Garling on the other. Our Kobe is definitely the underdog in this lineup. I love that he's here though, because Kobe is the representative of the future of the Marines. And the reason why Oda has placed him here is to serve as an ideological counter to Fleet Admiral Sakazuki, and perhaps even Kuzan, who left the Marines, no longer seeing it as a viable path to justice. Look, by the end of this series, one of the characters on this page will be the Pirate King, and another one of the characters will be Fleet Admiral. And I think that the latter will be Kobe. Realistically, he will outlast almost every character on these pages. And honestly, I don't know if this is going to be a controversial thing to say, but I don't see it as entirely outrageous to suggest that Kobe is the person who is going to end up with the One Piece, and thus be the one to make the big decision about which direction this world goes in. Of everyone here, I kind of trust him the most. The other surprise to me is Kuzan, because we all knew that he was a pretty big deal being a former admiral and everything, but I didn't expect him to be this close to the heart of the climax, and it's starting to make me even more ridiculously curious about his history. I'm starting to wonder a lot more about every character shown here actually, specifically if any of them also happen to be secret hidden Ds, because these are the 12 chosen candidates of fate, so they all have something deeper going on. Sabo we can rule out because he has the inherited will of Ace, who was a D, and he's also the 3rd character in a row I've mentioned with a curious aesthetic trait. Something I don't think I've ever really noticed is how much Oda relies on the bandage across the nose idea to indicate injuries. On this final page, we see Kobe, Sabo, and Kuzan all recovering from major battles, and all seem to have been injured in that exact same spot across their nose. Although in Kobe's case, it's a band-aid, not a bandage, so it's more like he scratched his nose on a particularly sharp branch or something. I think Oda does it because it's an easy way to indicate injury without obscuring the face too much and thus making expressions difficult. But also when we see King earlier, he has a bandage across his nose as well. Anyway, that isn't relevant to anything, I just think it's a fun artistic habit to point out. But it's not all about which characters were included on this page. I'm also surprised by who Oda didn't include in this lineup, like say Monkey D. Garb, who very likely isn't dead, and when he gets unfrozen, he's still going to be a pretty huge force to be reckoned with. But I guess this goes back to the Kobe thing. You'll notice that everyone here is relatively young, and by that I mean 40 and under, and the elderly who are showcased, such as Figgle Garling, Sakazuki, and the oldest boy of all, Emu, all represent the remnants of former generations that need to be overcome to change the world. And I guess that Garb does also fall into that category of times gone by and needing to move past him. As Vegapunk says in this chapter, a new age is heralded by the passing of old legends. So we do still need a handful of old legends to have that passing. And while we do see Imu, some key figures very much missing from these pages are the Elder Stars themselves, further solidifying that their role has been forever diminished, and who knows, Egghead Island might be the last stop on the One Piece train for all of them. But with this, the final saga is now set up. Egghead Island is the pre-game analysis for our sports metaphor that I can't be bothered to flesh out properly, but we've now gone through all of the players except for one. On the final 2 pages, there is something that I did not expect this late into the game, because we have what looks to be another ODA silhouette of a disgustingly important character who we've still yet to meet. Although what we do know is that he's carrying a sword that looks eerily similar to Shanks' Blade Griffin, and also Figgle and Garling's as of yet unnamed Sharp Metal. So what we could be dealing with here is another Holy Knight, and even a potential relative of Shanks. But that is far from the only option, and we'll be going into all of the speculation as to who this mystery person is in the next video.